Welcome into the Autzen Audibles Podcast. Matt Prehm, Erik Skopil, Jared Mack on this Monday edition. Welcome to the show. It's week 5 of the college football season, if you could believe that or not. We are now officially past the third of the season. The Ducks are 3-1 on the season, going into a home game against Stanford, 8 p.m. kickoff. Ooh, that's going to be late. FS1, I believe, is the TV channel. Ducks have opened up as a massive favorite, 15. It's jumped up to 16.5 points. I'm sure this mailbag is going to address a lot of what we saw last week in Oregon's thrilling 44-41 win at Washington State, while also looking ahead to this weekend's matchup against an opponent that, just like their previous one, has tended to ruin some seasons or give Oregon some fits when it's been unexpected.
Yeah, no, we were talking on the drive back about kind of teams that have given Oregon trouble historically, and it's been, for whatever reason, Washington State and Stanford. And I think we settled on, over the last 10 years, there's been do we say 3 seasons counting the COVID year where they've swept both Washington State and Stanford? I think that's what it is. So speaks to the difficulty of winning these two games. In fact, they're back to back. And we'll get to some Stanford stuff on the back end, so I don't want to jump too much into it. But and then, of course, throughout this week more. But, the Stanford program is not on the same trajectory it had been for most of all the 2010s. And it felt like at least the early part of the 2020s where it was like, well, they could be pretty competitive. That maybe they're not quite there right now, but we'll see. We'll get into more of that throughout the week, including a question at the end of the show. But we're going to start with some Bo Nix talk, because I think that's a good place to just kind of a continuation from some of what we talked about on Saturday. First question from @Hodges_Ryan. How important has the Dillingham-Nix connection become? I know we are only a quarter of the way through the season, but it feels like the connection is paying some big dividends early. Autzen Audibles. Thanks for using the hashtag. I believe 4 out of the 5 questions we've selected did, and that makes it very easy to find your questions. Sometimes I find it without, but for the most part, the hashtag is kind of what leads me to your question. So if you want your questions asked on the show, that's the best way to do so. I wanted to start with the Dillingham part first, just because I feel like we gave some praise to him on Saturday, but we didn't give as much as needed. And I think it stood out last night. It's been a crazy couple of days of travel. I mean, it took like 7 hours to drive back from Pullman. So I hadn't had a chance to watch the opposing head coach press conference, but it really stood out to me what Jake Dickert said when I watched it on Sunday night, which was just like, that scheme is really, really good. Like, he was effusive in his praise for how Oregon called that game and how difficult it made it for Washington State's defense to respond. And Dickert's a stand-up guy who also was, taking some responsibility. Like, we need to be better defensively. But he said at a certain point, it was just, what answers do you really have for some of what Oregon was throwing at them? And a lot of credit to just sort of the way that they manufactured some of those long passes with the rollouts and the routes going across the field and the athletes they have. And just like at a certain point, they figured out areas that they could take advantage of because of speed and athleticism and because of the ability to protect him in the pocket and get him moving around. And we just didn't have a whole lot we could do about it. And that was the kind of plays that I think changed this game for Oregon. Throughout the game, they had success throwing the ball in those kind of play. I think one of the first big completions of the game was a play like that over the cross, a kind of a crossing route over the middle of the field for a big gain. And they just kind of went back to that over and over, along with mixing in a bunch of run stuff. But I just wanted to kind of point that out, because I think we've talked a lot about Dillingham's struggles in the red zone, and there were some shortcomings there. But the rest of the field, I thought he was pretty darn good. And I think it's interesting kind of hearing the opposing coach perspective on that. Regarding their relationship, one of the things we did talk about coming in to this season was, if you look at Nix's career at Auburn, his 3 seasons, his best year was his freshman year statistically. It was his year with his most passing yards, most touchdowns. I don't know if it was fewest interceptions or not, but you look at it and you go, that's maybe a quarterback who's kind of, you don't want to say regressed, but struggled to kind of maintain the kind of production he had early on in his career when he was the SEC Freshman of the Year. Clearly, there's a good connection here between the two. Clearly, this is somebody that respects his position coach, respects his offensive coordinator. Even Bo, going back and kind of listening to it again, just said, Kenny got hot in the second half. That was a big part of our success. So I just think it is important to kind of talk about the dynamic here, because as easy as it is to say, yeah, Bo just made some awesome plays, which he 100% did. I think Dillingham deserves a ton of credit, because you think about, sure, some of the throws were really tough. The one to Bucky on that 4th down to extend that drive is, again, having watched that from a couple different angles now, one of the better throws you'll see on a Saturday. But a lot of the throws that were made were set up by, I think, really good scheme and really good play calling from Coach Dillingham. So I think it's important to kind of that these two do work in kind of concert with each other.
It's a massive connection. I think we've talked about this before, and how good Nix was at Auburn as a true freshman, winning freshman of the year. And then, having one of his best statistical seasons. I think you could maybe argue that it wasn't just because his interceptions. I think that was the most he threw in his career in that season, but it also was him as a true freshman. So that's something to take away from it. But Nix has been outstanding this year, and the connection with Dillingham absolutely has something to do with that. I mean, those guys are just comfortable. It's a lot easier coming into an environment where you have a general idea of what the offense is going to be, how the guy coaches. I mean, it's only been 3 years since those guys were together at Auburn, so it's not like both of them really have changed that much. And on Saturday against Washington State, I rewatched the game, and the schematics that Dillingham's offense, just like I came away with after BYU, is just really impressive. There's just a lot of quick nuances, and then there's honestly a lot of the passes are decisions made by the defense, and what Nix does as a 4th-year starter and his experience on the football field. And he watches the safety, and whatever way the safety goes, Nix goes the other way. And that's like a huge part of what Kenny Dillingham does in the passing attack. So this connection is vital. I don't know what it would be like if it were a different starting quarterback in other than Nix, and what that connection would be like. I think it would work, because I think Dillingham's offense is a lot of easy throws as well as some shots down the field, which is really important to get your quarterback going. But I thought it was interesting that Nix said that Dillingham got hot as well. I mean, I've never really heard about a coordinator getting hot, more about a quarterback getting hot. But he was rolling. I mean, that offense was really working the entire game. It just, other than in the red zone. And on the rewatch of those red zone plays, Washington State, they just handed it to Oregon. They just blew up every play. Those are plays that worked last week against BYU, another formidable defense. And against Washington State, they just jumped in. Their sideline to sideline speed was really great in the red zone area, but not really that good in the open field. And Oregon took advantage of that, and then ultimately figured out how to score in the red zone the last couple drives. So it worked out in the end. But I think this connection is huge now, and it's huge moving forward, and that's a lot of confidence those two have built up in each other.
I think Dillingham knows the strengths of Nix and is playing into those. I think a lot of these games, the first 4 weeks of the season, have started off with Bo Nix getting short passes, screens, or quick outs, or slants. They're not taking deep shots all that often in the first 10 or 15 plays of the game, and that's allowing Nix to get into a rhythm. It's allowing him to see the defense a little bit before having to make a real critical decision. And by the time that time arrives, he's kind of in a rhythm, and he's in a flow. He's got the confidence. He's making throws. He's seeing the defense. I also think, the fact that he's playing in front of a really good offensive line and 0 sacks is a big piece of this. He was sacked 17 times in 2019, 21 times, which is almost twice a game in 2020, and then 12 times. He didn't play, I think, the final 4 games of the season at Auburn last season in 2021. So he was put on his back quite a bit by the opponents. And I think having a clean pocket, knowing you have the time to let the plays develop, is also a critical piece here. And the connection between Dillingham and Nix is paying off. Highest career average in yards per completion at 8.3. He's got the highest QBR rating so far in his career. It's 162.4. That's 32 points higher than what it was in 2021. His completion percentage is at 72%. That's 11 spots higher than what it was last season in 2021. he's on pace to destroy his most touchdowns thrown in a season. He's at 10 right now, which was 16, which came in 2019 under Dillingham. I just think we're seeing the maturation of a quarterback in his fourth year, playing in his second year with an offensive coordinator. I understand it's two different teams, but there's some familiarity there. And they're running what works for him. And I can't say if that did or didn't happen at Auburn, because I quite honestly didn't watch a ton of Auburn games. I haven't gone back and watched full clips of him at Auburn to just get a better feel. But what they're doing at Oregon fits his skill set, and they're not asking him to go above and beyond that, and they're not holding him back from things that he can do as well. They're letting him try and make plays.
Yeah, it's been a really encouraging start to the season for the quarterback position. It kind of felt like maybe the big question going into the year offensively. You knew you had the offensive line. You felt good about the young tight ends coming back. I think Cam McCormick deserves a little more shout out just because he's been, I think, tremendous through 4 games. Running back position, you knew you had a lot of guys. You didn't know how it was going to fit together, but you thought there were some pieces there. And receiver, kind of the same thing as running back. You didn't know the hierarchy was. You've kind of seen some of that together with Bucky being the clear number 1 running back, and I think Troy Franklin becoming the clear number 1 wide receiver. But you kind of felt like those positions would work themselves out, assuming the quarterback play was good. And you saw a kind of a tough opener against Georgia. And the last 3 games, you've seen pretty darn good quarterback play, better than that. I think you could say this is probably the best 3-game stretch from an Oregon quarterback since Justin was here. I don't think that's that much of a stretch. And boy, you could probably match these 3 games up. I haven't gone and done it yet against any 3 games over Justin's career and say, yeah, it's probably pretty comparable to even his best stretches. So not saying he's better than Justin Herbert. That would be laughable. That would be a real tough angle for me to take. But just saying from a pure production,
that'd be a tough hill to die on.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to. I would rather die on another hill, to be honest with you. But I think you could make at least a compelling case in terms of the numbers that he's had about as good of a 3-game stretch as Justin. I'll have to go back and look, and if I'm way off, I'll make note of it the next time we're on this week. But really impressed with what we've seen from Bo Nix. All right, next question from @RugbyHalf. Obviously, it was a sloppy win. You'd rather play well start to finish, but don't you think the biggest takeaway you get from this game is the toughness of this team and the halftime adjustments made by the staff? Hashtag Autzen Audibles. I want to read a quote. There's several quotes from Dan on kind of resiliency and kind of the makeup of this team, but a quote he gave was, our locker room never wavered. The guys in the locker room, the sideline never wavered. They were composed and ready to finish the entire game. And I think we knew that a lot of the issues that we were facing were self-inflicted wounds that we've got to clean up. I think that never wavering part, that's the only way you win a game like this, right?
Yeah.
Oregon
100%.
Oregon had been tested once this year in a game where they got down a lot. It was against a much better opponent, obviously, in Georgia. And you can argue that maybe they never wavered, but I think there was certainly not enough response to even make it competitive. It never got competitive. They lost by, I'll do the quick math, 7 scores. This time around, it got pretty hairy, and I was really impressed with the way they turned it around and the way they stuck with it and the way that there was, it's crazy to think about all that went down in that last 90 seconds. Even 3.5 minutes, if you will, of Oregon scores 3 touchdowns in that span. Washington State scores a touchdown in that span. There were 4 touchdowns scored in 3.5 minutes. That's nuts. But just the way that the offense executed, the defense executed, there was no margin for error in those sequences. If Washington State picks up an extra first down here, an extra first down there, the game is over. If Oregon doesn't score either of those touchdown drives, the game is over. Obviously, that makes Foon a thing. If they allow a touchdown, that game gets maybe over, but Funa scores a touchdown. So they didn't need the touchdown there, but getting a stop in general was all they needed. But the outcomes that took place were what had to take place to win the football game. And basically, after being probably out-executed for about 56, 57 minutes, they dominated the last 3 and did everything they could to finish with the win. And I come away really impressed with this. There are certainly, as Dan said, a ton of things to work on. I think that's really obvious. We touched on a lot of those on Saturday's show. But I think you have to feel really, really good about kind of the way this team finished this game and the way they won this game and what this can do to maybe galvanize the team going forward into conference play.
Obviously, it's extremely impressive that they came back and won this game. With Dan talking about how the bench never wavered, I'm not surprised at all by that. I mean, they dominated the first half. The score just didn't reflect it. They had 321 yards of offense, 163 for Washington State, nearly doubled them. Their red zone inefficiencies were just the issue here. I think I talked about this on the podcast. If Oregon had scored touchdowns in all of their red zone trips like they really have been all season long, it would have been 28-10 going into half. That would have been without the Bo Nix interception and the pick six, which was the only points Washington State scored in the second quarter. They had 10 points in the first quarter. I'm not surprised that they weren't wavered. Obviously, it takes that mindset and that ability to come back and win this game because, you know what? They didn't go into halftime up 28-10. They were down. And so obviously they need to have some resiliency and some can-do-it attitude. Chop of wood carrying water, as Dan Lanning would say. I don't know what that means, but I think that's just talks about putting in the work. I love Coach Talk. That's one of my favorite quotes as well. This was an all-out just determination that they were going to win, and it really manifested in the last 5 minutes. And with Nix stepping up, with the defense stepping up at points, with Washington State going conservative on the play calling, that's not Oregon's fault. They just took advantage of that. And I'm sure if Washington State got a do-over with this, they wouldn't go as conservative. But
I don't know. I think they kind of just stick with the same screen game stuff that was working, and Oregon blew it up at the end. That's kind of what it felt like to me.
A little bit, yeah. But that was, the drive before the Mace Foon interception was pretty conservative. Huh. Oregon did tackle well in space for like the first time during most of the fourth quarter, so that also had something to do with it.
Right.
But again, this is just a team that was determined to go for it. And in terms of answering like the actual question, even though I've been talking for a little bit, just the biggest takeaway. And they made adjustments. They made a lot of adjustments. And at points, it didn't really look like those adjustments were working just because of inefficient tackling again for most of this game. But offensively, those adjustments worked. In the first half, Oregon was running the ball a lot. Because it was the first half of the game. But once they got down in the second half, they threw the rock a lot, and they put their team basically on Bo Nix's shoulders. And this is more praise for Nix, but that adjustment of throwing the ball a lot, making that the key component of their offense, it worked. And Nix was lights out, and he led this team down the field multiple times for scores. I think it's really impressive from this young of a coaching staff to be able to make these adjustments in this situation, in that environment, on the road. Your first conference game in Pullman is not an easy thing to do. To be down by 12 with, 6 minutes left in the third quarter, 5 minutes left in the third quarter, and to come back and win, even though it was crazy and hectic, and they still gave up a touchdown with 5 seconds left. Really really impressive, but they still got a lot of work to do.
I think the adjustments weren't player focused. It was more so play calling in the red zone. Let's run some more plays that have higher success rates. And I think it was okay the first one or two times to go into the red zone and run things that were working against BYU the previous week, because you need to see if Washington State is at the same level or better than the Cougars. But I think from a sideline to sideline standpoint, Washington State was a much faster team than BYU was. And I think it took Oregon staff a little bit to adjust to that. And when the field got condensed and they still tried to run sideline to sideline type plays in a short space, sometimes even to the short side of the field, they were blown up because Washington State is fast. Their defense has dudes that can fly. And it was very evident that Oregon could run the football effectively when they would spread things out and go right at them, run directly and use a play action. Or use guys out of the backfield after everyone's kind of leaked out. And I think that's how Oregon scored in the red zone in the second half, or after their first couple of issues in the red zone. So for me, it was like you guys both said, the Oregon offense never really got stopped from moving the football in this game. It was literally just an execution thing, and I think the execution was the Oregon offense, play callers running plays that had high success rates instead of plays that were low. And that was the halftime adjustment in my eyes, is just the play calling and the effectiveness inside the red zone compared from the first half to the second half.
All right, guys, I'm switching a question here because I feel like there's a question I think would be better on the back half. So I hate to do this. In the show notes, it's going to be backwards, but I just decided on the fly to do this way. So apologize.
Okay, let's do it.
From @TyEnglish13, what are your thoughts on Cardwell's situation? Is he still injured, or is this a case of him being fifth in the rotation? It's just very confusing to see as a fan. #Autzen Audibles. Yeah, Byron is still going through some sort of an injury. Again, Dan's pretty tight-lipped in terms of details on this stuff. I think looks like ankle foot kind of thing. I think it's an ankle, honestly. He's got his ankles been kind of taped up, but I couldn't tell you one way or the other. There was a couple of players that before the game were working with the training staff just to kind of test things out. I believe he was one of them, wasn't he, Jared? Wasn't it him?
No.
Was it just flow and walk?
Flow and walk. That was
okay.
It, yeah.
So it wasn't even Byron. So maybe it was determined. He traveled, by the way, like he was there.
Yeah,
so
he was
like
there.
And you have a condensed travel roster, so you don't travel a guy who's like completely incapable of playing. I think you can only. We still don't know the exact number. I think it's 74. It said 70 online somewhere, and then we counted 74. So we're like, I don't know. It's 74, 75, somewhere in that range.
So I don't want to cut you off, but Cardwell's mom on Twitter said he was healthy, ready to go.
Okay. Well, that's interesting.
So that
sure
answers the was he healthy or not healthy debate.
Okay. Well, and then if we're getting into this part of it, has he been practicing fully?
I don't know.
No.
Yeah.
If he's been practicing fully, that's one thing. If he hasn't been it's one thing to say he's healthy. It's one thing to say has he been practicing fully, right?
Yeah.
Because from what we've seen, he hasn't been.
And so maybe that's what it is. I also know that parents can get very protective of their kids' playing time. And Byron was looked at as somebody who was supposed to come in and be. We talked about it going into the spring, into the fall, into the off season of like he's probably going to be the guy. And then I started hearing, right before fall camp, like really be careful on how you're framing this, because it sounds like he's not only is he not the guy, he might not be close to being the guy.
Right.
And that's when we started talking about the Buckies and the Noahs, and those guys are having really good, might be guys to kind of monitor. The transfers are really good. I imagine let's put it this way. When he has been healthy, when has he entered? I think he's been the fourth guy, both games.
Yeah.
Is my recollection against Georgia and Eastern before whatever injury took place.
I just think that this kind of goes back to the question we got last week with Thornton and what are you going to do? And there's only so many carries in a game. And this is one in which they had to throw the football quite a bit. And sports is a game. Sports is something that the best play. And if you're not the best player at the position or the second or sometimes third best player at the position, your chances of playing time are limited. And the reality is the staff feels like Bucky and Noah are ahead of Byron Cardwell. And it's not like Bucky and Noah aren't producing. And we have a small sample size of Cardwell from last season or this year where he's producing well. But the reality is as conference games show up, we see this in basketball. Benches get tightened, shortened. And this is what we're seeing. I just don't think Cardwell is, in the eyes of the staff, as good as Bucky, as good as Noah. And until Noah and Bucky don't perform, why would you pull them off?
Yeah, I think it's as simple as what Matt just said. I think Cardwell has been dealing with an injury, and that held him out against BYU specifically. He might be healthy, but clearly he was still limited in practice. His ankle is still heavily taped. I think anybody knows that you're going to need a fully functioning ankle to be a running back. I think Cardwell is full of talent. I was somebody who thought he'd come into the season as a starter, but I don't know. Are you or one of you guys going to take out Bucky or Whittington for Cardwell right now? No, and that's the thing. That's exactly what Matt just laid out. Who are you gonna not give reps to? And if Dollars is a third down running back, which he has seen to be and has been productive at points, then that's your 1, 2, and 3. If Byron is the fourth guy looking in, that's just kind of how it is.
He's not even the fourth guy because when they go short yardage,
they go
Jordan James, right? So so this is how, if you want to just look at it from roles perspective, this is kind of what I outlined Saturday. It seems like you've got two guys that you rotate through first and second down primarily, and that's Bucky and that's Noah. And in the first half of the last 2 games, it's been almost entirely one series Bucky, second series Noah, third series Bucky, fourth series Noah. And in the second half, they kind of go with the hot hand and mix those two, interchange those two a little bit more. And then third down, if it's a passing situation, in comes Sean Dollars. If it's a run situation, in comes Jordan James, and so forth and so on. So that's kind of where you're at. And, I think it'll be interesting to see with Cardwell what he decides to do. If he's like 100% healthy, and we're hearing from, like, it sounds like from his mom that he is, I disagree from what I'm watching in practice because of what we're seeing, where it looks like he's doing some and not all of it. And his ankle is pretty taped up. And it is interesting. If he's cleared to play and he makes the trip and his mom says he's healthy and he's available and he doesn't even get any reps, I think that's really telling, because to distinguish between the question about Dante last week and 7, we've had a couple about that. Those guys are still playing 20 plus snaps per game. I was just looking on PFF to see how many snaps did Dante play against BYU after that question. He played 21 snaps against BYU. He just was targeted once and the ball bounced off his hands, was intercepted. Cardwell made the trip and just never saw the field.
Yeah.
A little bit different. Dante's like your 5th guy and actually had a really nice play this last game. Had a nice 42-yard catch. The running back rotation doesn't allow you to be the 5th guy and play very much. In fact, this is what fans have been, it's funny because this is what fans have been complaining about was they're trying to play 5 guys, don't play 5 guys. Well, they're condensing the rotation. It's just the guy that the fans really like is now left out of it, whether it's by health or just by a fit in the rotation. So it is interesting. I will be curious to see this upcoming week against Stanford if there's an opportunity to get benches emptied. What do you do with Byron? Does he come in late in the game? If maybe he gets to be a full participant at practice, and now we're looking at him as somebody who plays a different role. We'll see, but I think it's certainly one of the more interesting offensive kind of storylines right now. This is a guy everybody thought was going to be a big part of the offense, and he played quite a bit the first 2 games. He hasn't played at all the last 2.
And it's not like, just looking at the stats here. I mean, Bucky's 6th in the conference in yards per average at 6.97. He's in the top 10 in rushing yards at 265 total yards. And you look at the guys who are in the top 7 of the league. You have 56 carries for Jaden Ott, 60 carries for Valladay at Arizona State. You have Travis Dye is one of the few that has less than 50. He's got 49. Washington's got a running back at 48, and then Charbonneau at UCLA is 43. Tavion Thomas at Utah is 61. But all of those guys have even more carries than him, have more opportunities. They have more yards, but they have more opportunities. And Whittington is not very far behind. He's at 14th in the country, or in the conference, at 175 on the year rushing. But he's over 5 yards a carry too. Oregon hasn't had a lot of running backs since 2016, I believe, go over 5 yards a carry in a season. And right now, Oregon has 2 of them. And so,
Cardwell's there too. I mean, Cardwell averages 6.9. So
yeah, so
they've got a bunch.
It's just a case of you can't, like you said it best, you can't feed everybody, because if you do, then the fans are going to be complaining that why don't they pick one guy? Why don't they pick 2 guys and let them get a bulk of the work? That's what's happening. two guys are getting a bulk of the work now, and it's just not Byron Cardwell. And that's sports. That's fine.
It's honestly what it is, but mostly it's not the two guys fans want it to be. Fans thought their expectations the whole season that it was going to be Byron, and it's not right now, whether it's because of health or something else. And I think people are frustrated. I mean, we see it on the message board right now. Oregon just had, I think, a really impressive game of running the football, and there's still people saying favoritisms at play, that Lachlan is playing his guy. And not to extend this too much, but Noah Whittington is a player who I think people were pretty down on after the first couple of games. People are saying he's not like a major Power 5 running back. I went and looked at his PFF grade yesterday, and it's significantly better than anyone on the teams was last year, which was surprising to me. But his PFF grade is close to 80, which is very good. And he had a couple rough moments in the first couple of games. I talked about those. Thought that kind of bad luck in terms of what opened up. And people kind of felt like they lost trust or something in him. And I thought he performed really well against Washington State. And I think it's warranted that he plays the reps he gets. I don't think there's any favoritism at play.
It's the same thing with Irving. You know, when Irving dropped like 2 or 3 passes in the first 2 weeks, everybody said, "Why is this guy playing?" And then 4th and 2, who does Nix go to over the middle? 30 yards down the field, 25 yards down the field. It's Bucky Irving. This is a really talented running back room, and I mean, frankly, we're only having this conversation because of how good Oregon's offensive line is, and that they're all able to eat, and that they're all able to have these good stats. But I don't know about you guys, but when you watch the games, I've never seen Byron Cardwell do anything like Bucky Irving has in some of his runs. It's been extremely phenomenal what Irving has done behind this offensive line and in this offense. So I think it's clear as day. And this goes back. I think we've belittled the point at this point, but it goes back to what Matt said. This is football. You're either good and you play, or you're not and you don't. And I think Byron Cardwell is really talented and he's really good, but these guys just might be better.
All right, it's going to take a break here on the Autzen Audibles podcast. All right, welcome back to the Autzen Audibles podcast. 3 questions in, 2 more to go. The questions have been changed on me, but I do believe it's now time to look ahead instead of in the past of what's happened the last couple of weeks.
That's exactly right, which is why I made the change here, because I felt like we should just stick with future stuff here, like looking forward, because we just did 3 questions that have been, If you're looking in the past, let's turn to the future. This one's from @DokeRoki. What are the chances an 8-1 Oregon hosts a 9-0 Washington for College Game Day on November 12th? #Autzen Audibles. I brought this up, Matt, because we were
talking about it.
This exact discussion on the drive back from Pullman on Sunday morning of like, you know what? Oregon's schedule is pretty favorable from here. Washington's schedule is very favorable from here. Matt even pulled up kind of the November 12th slate and started looking through there and being like, is it going to be potentially like an LSU, Alabama, or some kind of big time, I don't know, an Ohio State, Michigan game? And there's not really, from what it looked like, and maybe something will develop where other teams get hot and there is like a top 10 matchup elsewhere. But right now you kind of look at it and try to project forward. I think that's a pretty, if both teams take care of business, that's a scenario that I could see taking place. And for Oregon, you look at the upcoming schedule here. They go Stanford this week. They go to the road against Arizona. They go bye week. They host UCLA. That'll be a challenge. That's probably the biggest challenge on this run, in my opinion. And they hit the road for Cal and Colorado, and then they come back and play Washington. I think Oregon will be favored in every one. I'm very confident Oregon will be favored in every one of those games, probably by a score, 7 points or more in most of them. And if they take care of business, win those games, they're going to be 8-1. And if you look at Washington's schedule, I think there's a really good chance that they're 9-0. And I think it adds up that you'd have game day here, which would just add to this game, because I'd forgotten about this, Matt, until I saw you posted it on social media, that these two teams haven't played at Autzen since 2018, since that miraculous overtime game where Verdell walks it off with the overtime touchdown, because in 2020 they were scheduled to play, but COVID got in the way. And the reason for the COVID getting in the way, the impact of that was the conference championship was, flipped and all sorts of things. There's a lot of animosity. And frankly, this could be an all-time great game between this rivalry, because for the most part, over the last, 2 or 3 decades, When Oregon's good, Washington's been crappy. When Washington's been good, Oregon's been crappy. This might be a rare time where both these teams are pretty good.
This is, yeah, I mean, the chances are super high. I mean, I don't have too much else to say because, Erik, you just outlined the situation and where these guys could meet at 8-1 and 9-0. And it would be a hell of a game. That the 2018 game on the walk-off touchdown for Verdell, that was the last time they were in Autzen. Just like Erik mentioned, this would be just as good. This would be a great first introduction for Dan Lanning into the Washington rivalry. Same with Kellen DeBoer. I think this is hopefully it happens. Like Erik mentioned, the team might get hot somewhere else in the country, and it could be an up and down potentially where there might be another option for game day to go to. But looking ahead, this is a lot of weeks ahead right now. But things look to be moving their way into this possibility, which would just be spectacular for the Oregon football brand.
Look, let's just push game day aside here for a second. This is our call to Josh Pate that it's time that the Every Given Sunday tour comes west.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the game to do it because Pate loves college football and he's not been out west. This is a perfect situation to get him familiar with the West Coast brand of football in one of the most vile rivalries in college football. This is what makes college football awesome. You have two teams, one above the state, one below the state. They hate each other. Their fan bases hate each other. There has been a ton of back and forth jabs with previous staffs here. Like you said, they haven't been here since 2018. And like you said, Erik, these two teams rarely play each other when both teams are good. And typically when they are, everything gets cranked up a notch or 3. And I would think there's going to be a lot of UW fans at this game. It's going to have the potential for 2 top 10 UW Oregon teams to be meeting each other because these are the schedules that they play before they meet in Eugene on November 12th. And it's a long ways to go, but like you said, winnable games. Oregon plays Stanford at home, at Arizona, UCLA at home, at Cal, at Colorado, and then they get a bye week going into that Washington game. It would be a stunner if Oregon loses 2 of those games. It would almost be a stunner in my eyes, at least, if they lose 1 of those games that Oregon has to play before Washington. And then you look at the Huskies schedule. At UCLA on Friday this week, they play at ASU. Then they get Arizona. They get at Cal. And then the week before, and then Oregon State. And they, too, get a bye week before Oregon. So that Oregon State game could be dicey. This Friday's game against UCLA will show us a lot for Washington. But the feeling is both of these teams should have a combined 1 or 2 losses added to their names by the time they meet. And the real possibility of 2 top 15, 2 top 10 teams is there. And so if game day doesn't come, we got to get Josh Pate out here. And maybe it should be screw game day, get Josh Pate out here anyways. And let's show him what West Coast football and Oregon football is like, because we've heard it forever. Oregon is like the SEC of the West from a fan perspective, from a tailgate perspective, from an atmosphere perspective. Let's get Pate out here to see that and see if it's true.
I also just want to meet that guy. I've watched so many of his videos, and we've messaged back and forth.
I know.
It'd be fun to chat with him. Hopefully, he makes it out here. I did want to clarify: Oregon's bye week is October 15th, not right before the Washington game.
Oh, it's not? I had it wrong.
And the only reason I bring it up is because I have a trip to the coast I was really excited about.
This is true.
That I was going to be like, boy, if I got that wrong, I would have to send
That'd be unfortunate. Yeah, I'm
make a phone call.
Neither does Oregon State, or neither does Washington. It's just math is hard.
Okay.
Fair enough. but your point remains entirely is the point I was making is the schedules for both teams are very, very favorable. And again, Washington and Oregon neither plays USC this year, which is like going to make
this is the year to do it, to not play them.
This is going to make
they're actually pretty good.
They're actually really good. This could be a really interesting run for the conference championship. Not to just further this too much, but you think about Utah, USC, Oregon, Washington. I'll throw UCLA in as a kind of the 15 to maybe monitor. It could be really tight coming down to the end here, and that part of it also shouldn't be lost. We haven't mentioned it, but this November 12th game with Washington, the winner of that could be kind of pushed right into the conference championship game, or both. The winner of that game could drop another game later, and neither team makes it because of the new rules and all that. So I think it's going to be fascinating. But I've got that one certainly circled on my schedule, as do I the weekend after, November 19th, when Oregon hosts Utah. It's going to be an absolute.
It's a tough back-to-back.
grueling November schedule. And then they go to Oregon State the following weekend. I mean, Oregon finishes with 3 really tough games. They start with a bunch of tough games. Middle section here that we're entering feels a little bit light, and then it ends really tough. All right, last question. And this is a focused on Stanford question, which is, I thought, a good way to end it. At Hero541YT, how do you guys feel Oregon stacks up with Stanford and their pass game? The Cardinal have some Redwood-sized receivers and a competent enough quarterback in the key. So that matchup intrigues me, considering Stanford's struggles of late. Stanford's struggles of late is a good place to start. This is a program that is really not on the incline, that's for sure. I mean, it's hard to say it any other way. The last time I believe they beat an FBS team was when they beat Oregon last year. I think that's correct. Did they beat Colgate this year? That's their only win this year, and then they lost every game to end last year. I mean, it's tough down there, man. I mean, and it's a Stanford program that I talked about earlier on the show has for so long been one of the biggest thorns in Oregon's side. And I'm not going to say this weekend won't be that, but some of the sizzle from an Oregon-Stanford rivalry, we talk about the Oregon-Washington rivalry amping up. We talk about the Oregon-Utah rivalry, the Oregon-Oregon State, Oregon-Washington State, some of these games. If Oregon does face USC in a conference championship game, how these games will be kind of perceived. The Oregon-Stanford one's kind of losing its luster, even though Stanford's still been incredibly competitive in the most recent iterations of these games, including last year's. Just can't get over how Oregon lost that game. It's been a year. But to the question here, it's an interesting one, because what Oregon does best defensively, Stanford's kind of probably not going to rely on its run game very much. Hasn't been very good so far this year. What Oregon struggles with has been covering receivers on long developing kind of routes. And that's where Stanford could pose some problems. Tanner McKee is a very competent quarterback. We saw that last year. We saw that even, I think, for part of the game in 2020 when Davis Mills was out with COVID. McKee played in the second half of that game. McKee's been solid this year. He's actually third in the conference in yards per attempt with 9.3. He's averaging about 270 yards passing per game. That's fifth. His quarterback rating is like seventh, but there's a bunch of guys with great quarterback rating scores in this conference right now. I mean, the quarterback play, this is another conversation for another time, but has just in general been really pretty outstanding for the most part. Like, there's a lot of new
compared to last year. Yeah.
A lot of newcomers.
Good
and
Lord. It's
been so much better than it was last year. Like there are about 6 guys that feel like they're better than just about anybody on the conference who was starting a year ago. But like, his touchdown interception ratio hasn't been great. 6 touchdowns, 4 picks. I think 2 of those were in the red zone against USC in a game that could have been even, could have been a little closer. And then to the Redwood receiver question, or part of the question, yeah, I mean, Stanford living up to their I guess, identity and kind of the stereotype here. The 4 main receivers are Michael Wilson, he's 6'2", John Humphreys, he's 6'5", Elijah Higgins, he's 6'3", and Bryson Tremaine, who's 6'4". So these are big guys on the outside, and the size of a Triquez Bridges, who's been kind of a weakness, has been a weakness this year in coverage. Maybe he can kind of offset some of that by being at least similar size to these guys, but he needs to get in and out of his breaks quicker. He needs to, cover space better, as to not get beaten frequently. But I do agree with kind of the question here of this as being probably, for me, the big question is I'm expecting Oregon's offense to do just fine. I don't think there's many teams in this conference that will slow Oregon's offense with regularity, and I certainly don't think it's Stanford right now. But the question is, can Stanford hang around, make things interesting in a shootout? Could Oregon make some mistakes and kind of like last year's game gives, enough rope to hang themselves and Stanford wins in kind of just a surprising fashion? And the only reason I bring it up is because of the question here, which I think is spot on, which is that Stanford has the quarterback and has some big receivers on the outside to maybe take advantage of what I don't even think is a perceived weakness at this point. It just is a weakness, which is its pass coverage.
Yeah, no, this is not a great matchup on paper if you're Oregon, where your biggest weakness is your secondary. And you bring Tanner McKee, who's a very competent quarterback, who's probably going to be drafted, who is probably going to get, I don't know, probably some shot in the NFL with a franchise to be a backup quarterback. And then a bunch of tall receivers. Not great, not exactly what you want. I think the only thing that Oregon might have going for them is that Stanford isn't much of what Washington State and BYU were, where they're passing along the perimeter. They are more north-south than honestly, probably any other team in the Pac-12. Because that's just kind of the Stanford tradition is they're going to run the ball and try to throw it deep and maybe have big crossing routes to their tight ends or their big receivers over the middle. That might be a benefit to Oregon just because Oregon does have some size in their secondary at least. Like Brian Addison is 6'5", Triquez Bridges is a tall guy with a huge wingspan. Christian Gonzalez is a bigger guy or a bigger cornerback who's really well built. Even someone like Bennett Williams, who isn't the tallest, is a well built guy. Oregon's defense has some size, which I think does help them in this case. But it is going to be a testament to how long Oregon can cover, and if Oregon's pass rush can get to McKee, excuse me. Because that was a thing that happened against Ward where their pass rush was actually able to get there. Tanner McKee is not as agile as Cameron Ward, so maybe there might be a few more sacks if that same pass rush can last. But that's the first game that Oregon has had a pass rush. It would be a really nice time for them to go back-to-back weeks with one against Stanford. But that'll have to see. Stanford's offensive line is always pretty good. This year it's probably not as good as it has been in the past, but that's a little unfair to compare because they've had some monsters on those lines in years prior. But yeah, covering is not necessarily a strength for Oregon. I think that's pretty darn fair to say. It's a weakness, and these guys could potentially expose that weakness on a grand scheme. And this could be another one of those wacky Oregon and Stanford games. That wouldn't be all that surprising to me, just considering the history in the last couple of years. But I think Oregon has the benefit that Stanford is not as athletic or as schematic as Washington State and BYU were to attack along the perimeter and go more north-south than east-west.
I got some thoughts because clearly, yes, Oregon does have the weakness in the secondary. You look at Stanford and you look at what they do from a passing perspective and the guys that they have. They got some dudes. They no doubt about it. Michael Wilson is one of the best receivers in the conference. He's third in the league in yards per game. His average is just astronomically high. He leads the conference there at 22.15 yards per catch. He's got 4 touchdowns, which is near the top in the conference as well. They have talent to put up big numbers in the passing game. You brought up Tanner McKee, 5-star quarterback. NFL eyes are certainly watching him. John Humphreys is another receiver that they've got that makes plays. They've got some tight ends that are big-bodied dudes. But the difference here is their offensive line is not good. And they rank 81st in PFF in pass protection. They are second. They're tied for last, actually, in the conference in sacks allowed. They have allowed 13 sacks through 3 games. Washington State has allowed 13 sacks through 4 games. So really, if you break those numbers down, right, Stanford's even worse. Their game averages are 4.33 sacks allowed. So it's kind of one of those ones where I think Erik was talking about it last week after the Washington State game, was that the Cougars struggles kind of feed into Oregon's struggles here. And I think that's going to play out here a little bit as well, where they can't protect their quarterback. And this is going to be an opportunity for Oregon to go out and develop its pass rush and to get to Tanner McKee, because this is an offense that's going to hold the ball even longer than
much longer
that Washington State did. And that's going to open the avenues for hits on McKee. And so while they have the studs at receiver, because they've got a really good one, and I'm imagining Gonzo is going to be on him pretty much the entire game, they can't protect McKee. And McKee is not Cameron Ward. He's not Jalen Hall at BYU, and he's not Stetson Bennett at Georgia. He's not mobile.
Is he Gunnar Talkington from Eastern Washington, Matt?
Maybe in the mobility standpoint. Probably a little bit better there. But everything sets up where, yes, if they have time to throw, it's going to be a concern. But I don't know if they're going to have that time to throw. And the tight ends of Stanford, they're living in the past off reputation. They have dudes there, but these guys are nowhere near as special as what they were in the late 2000s and the early 2010s. I just don't see it. And Stanford, itself, I mean, I threw this tweet out yesterday. In the last 10 games, they have 9 losses, 1 win. That only win is against Colgate. And their 9 losses have come by an average of 20 points scoring margin. They haven't been competitive against anybody at the FBS level. Their last win against an FBS team, as painful as it is against Oregon, in a game in which officiating errors opened the door for them to win that game. And also Oregon's offensive coordinator literally being in the hospital because he had a life-threatening emergency hours before kickoff. Oregon made mistakes in that game, absolutely, 100%. But that's their last win, and that's what it took for them to get a win. And so we joked at the top of the show that 16 points is a pretty high number. Maybe that's off the show, but when you look at the data and you look at what this team is from Stanford, like maybe it's right, maybe it feels right. I don't know. I still haven't decided yet, but I'm leaning towards Oregon kind of flirting with that cover. 16's really high, but this Stanford team is not good. They have good pieces, but this isn't basketball where 1 or 2 guys can carry your entire team to a deep run in March Madness. Football is 100% a team sport, and you can have 2 or 3 really special players, but it's not enough to carry you through a season.
Just one final thought I had, and also just to kind of reiterate the value of potentially this petition is, I think DJ Johnson's availability as Oregon's best pass rusher to play in this game, where you're right, Matt, Stanford's protection has not been great. McKee is also not Ward. He's not Hall. He's not Bennett. I don't know if he's going to talking to that kid. At least could move around a little bit. He just wasn't particularly effective throwing the football. He's not a very mobile guy, man. Like he's more of the Tom Brady, like 2022, not Tom Brady 20.
How about a Matt Ryan?
I'm just saying, like if you get to him, he's going to go down. Basically, is the point I'm making.
Yeah, Matt Ryan.
All right, Matt Ryan, Tom Brady 2022, but okay, sure, Matt Ryan. No Patriot hate here. My point is, like, if you can manufacture a pass rush, I think that's really important. And DJ Johnson, because of what I still think is a very questionable targeting call, is currently set to not play in the first half of Saturday's game. But I think Oregon will petition. I'd hope that they have a good chance of winning, and that he's available to play, because he's leading the team in sacks. He has 3 right now. He had 2 in the last game alone. I think he has some serious value there off the edge, because I haven't really seen a lot of other players bring it. And frankly, not that I'm probably sounding like I think Oregon is like going to really struggle in this game. I don't know if I think that's the case at all. I think Oregon's probably going to win pretty comfortably. But the kind of route for Stanford to make this interesting is they have time in the pocket. These receivers have time to run downfield. They take advantage of some weaknesses. If DJ's not there just haven't been a lot of players that have really presented the pass rush that I'd like to see to feel confident in Oregon just slamming the door here and getting up by 3 scores at half or something.
And that's fair.
Yeah.
And that's a fair take.
They're going to need somebody to disrupt. And Brandon Dorlus did a good job of that against Washington State. But you really need an edge guy in this case. You need to force Tanner McKee to step up into Dorlus, not Dorlus to step in and then have him run around, or have McKee run around. But yeah, no, that's a major key. That's a major factor into this game, is whether they can get a pass rush. And if McKee has time, that could be, like Erik mentioned, that could be a huge thing for why Stanford could come close to this. Just to say, I think Oregon should keep all of their coaches in bubble wrap all week long and make sure that nothing happens, because it's just gonna, I don't know. It's 16.5 points is a lot. I have a feeling that they're going to come close to covering that spread just because of how good their offense has been. But these are the games. Every time it looks like one of these teams is going to have a victory here, something happens.
Yeah.
A snap that goes airborne, an interesting call from a couple officials multiple times in the end zone. Just one of those games, man. And it's 8 p.m. So that makes it even worse. It's like the witching hour of Pac-12 in October. So don't forget, there's actual witching hours coming.
Yeah. Yes. It's going to do it for us here on the Autzen Audibles podcast. Thank you for submitting your questions. Thank you for listening to the show or watching it on YouTube. We'll be back later this week for more discussion on Oregon athletics or Oregon football as they gear up for this game at home against the Stanford Cardinal. Until then, you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.
Peace.